All right, so quick introduction. So Chandra is a partner at HBM Partners. So it's a venture capital firm. I think you're managing, I remember correctly, $1.7 billion. And yeah, so I just wanted to talk a bit more about investment in biotech. As Ulf has been mentioning, money tends to be a problem if you don't have enough of it. So yeah, I guess talking a bit more about investment strategies for a company like HBM. So you have a bit of an unusual strategy, let's say. So you, as you mentioned, so you have a fund that does not have a limit in terms of location and in terms of the time it takes to make a return. So can you tell us a bit more? Why are you doing this? Also, because you are one of the. Sorry, let me rephrase that. So it's not usual. So I just want to know why are you doing this and why it's an advantage, and maybe why other people are not doing it.
Okay, sure. So thanks first for inviting me here. In terms of our team, maybe to just set the stage, so most of the team is based in Zug, just outside of Zurich, but we're investing worldwide, you mentioned that. And so we invest a lot in the United States, but we obviously like to invest in Europe, including Switzerland, and we also invest in Asia. And we can do that with the Swiss team, but supported by venture partners and colleagues and advisors in those different geographies. One other part that is unusual, and I mean, as you said, most investment groups have a specific geographic focus, so that's not the case for us. We can technically invest anywhere in the world. The other point that Ulf already mentioned is that a lot of VCs, and I would say 95% or more of venture capital firms, have a fund life. So they raise a fund, which is a pot of capital that then gets invested in startup companies. And they basically enter an agreement with their own investors that they will return that money within a certain time frame, and that time frame is usually 10 years. So 10 years from the time that they raise the money from their investors to the time they sort of return it and wind up the fund. Obviously, since biotech is a relatively long-term endeavor, that doesn't work all the time, and of course you don't have to be there from day one when the company is born to the day the drug enters the market. Maybe you're only there for part of the time. But it's still, as Ulf said, it provides a certain restriction, and in biotech that is actually a topic that is discussed a lot, is sort of that 10 years, and actually more realistically it's maybe 6, 7, 8 years. Is that enough? So our fund is an evergreen fund, which means it's a permanent capital structure, and we can invest in companies and stay in those companies for extended periods of time if necessary. Of course, we still want to create returns for our investors, and so it's not like we are not interested in these so-called exits, so meaning a trade sale or an IPO of the company, but we are more flexible than other investors in terms of the timing.
Okay, do you think this is an advantage? Because I'm assuming, obviously for a company it can be good to have a bit more time, but I'm wondering whether that also makes them take longer to reach the point when you can actually make money out of them.
That doesn't tend to be a problem. No, I mean, so on the one hand, like most investors, we syndicate deals. That means in most companies, we're not the only investor, but we invest together with others. And so some of those other funds may have those restrictions. I think it can be an advantage because sometimes things just take longer than you think. It's also an advantage because we don't only invest on the private side, so in companies that are still private in terms of their ownership structure, but we can also accompany these companies as they go public in an IPO, and then we can invest after the IPO. And sometimes because value creation in biotech takes a long time, it makes sense, and you're rewarded for staying with the company after the IPO, maybe for many years, because you, in the end, you invest not in the idea that the company goes public. You invest in the underlying development of a drug that will then hit different milestones and pass regulatory events and ultimately become approved and so on. And so if you run out of time, it means you have to exit that, you have to sell your position in a public company before you reach that milestone. So being patient can also reward you in an industry where things sometimes take a long time.
Okay. Yeah, and actually, I think so. Many VCs tend to invest in at very early stage companies, but I know at HBM you also invest in later stage companies. So I just wanted to hear a bit more on what are the advantages of investing in a company that's more advanced.
Yeah, I mean, actually, just maybe for my benefit, can we have a quick show of hands? So who here has actually worked for a biotech company or is currently working for a biotech company? Okay, and who's from pharma or? Okay, good. Yeah, I mean, one thing to realize if you talk to venture capital investors, there are different types. So there are the financially motivated investors, there are strategic investors that may have a different view that may be affiliated with a pharma company. And there are earlier stage and later stage investors to a degree that also correlates with the size of the pot of capital that you're managing. So investors that have a small pot of capital, they basically invest in smaller rounds, which usually means earlier stage companies. For us, because we have a relatively larger amount of capital that we're managing, if we did very small early stage investments, we would have to do 100 of those, and that's something we cannot do with our current setup and the number of people that we have. So I think that is one element which basically drives for investors what type of investments they're seeking. That also then basically influences the risk profile that we're selecting, and as we invest in larger companies or in larger investment rounds, usually those companies are more advanced. So many of our companies, actually the vast majority of our companies are clinical stage, many are phase 2, phase 3. We even invest in commercial stage companies, but we can also occasionally invest in earlier stage companies.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think this question will be of interest of all the people that said they were working in biotech companies. What does a company need to have for you to invest in it? What do you think can make a difference?
Yeah, I mean, I think one piece of advice that's generally given and that we can only echo is that in starting a biotech company, you have to start with the end in mind. So you have to, even though initially it may be a certain technology or a certain scientific insight that drives starting the company, I think it's important to really look all the way to the patient. I mean, most of our investments are either biotech or pharma products, or in some cases also medical devices, diagnostics, digital health products or services that will impact the patient. And so I think the important part is really to sort of look all the way to the patient, even though that may be 5 or 10 years sort of in the future from when you start the company, and really be able to explain to the investors, but also to all other stakeholders, what is the benefit that you're driving for that patient. And so I think that's for us the primary prism that we look through. I mean, beyond that, obviously we want great management, and we want to have a patent position that can help you to defend it. You have to sort of look at the competitive landscape and be able to compete not just with what's out there today, but with the types of products and services that will be available many years from now when your product enters the market. So there are multiple other things, but I think being able to articulate what benefit you can generate for the patient that will be recognized also by payers and by physicians, I think that's the key question. Okay.
And what about the opposite? What is some common mistake you see some companies looking for funding do that makes you say this is not going to be a deal?
Yeah, I mean, so I think one point is that many people, if you start a company, and I can empathize with that, there's a lot of things that you want to keep secret about the company, and so obviously we also go through the non-disclosure agreements, and I mean, because we deal with a lot of companies, that is something that's very important to us. But I think generally speaking, as a founder, you should start early talking to as many people as you can. I mean, maybe once you've filed your patents, but then after that, talk to as many people as you can, because you need criticism and validation early on. And I think being secretive about your company makes life more difficult for you down the line. If you can talk to many people, they will sort of point you in the right direction. They will sort of put you in touch with other advisors or executives that can help you along the way. And ultimately, that for us is also important. I mean, it's not just an idea that drives the success of a company, but it's basically a team of people that can get behind that idea. And the sort of more well-rounded that team is, and the more perspectives you have considered, I think the more likely you're to succeed.
Okay. And so since you said so, your fund is not restricted to location, so you're investing all over the world. So I'm curious in learning a bit more about what difference you see between investing in Europe and investing in the US or any other areas of the world.
So most of the team are European. So I grew up in Berlin and went to medical school in Berlin, and many of the other colleagues are also European. So obviously we like Europe, and on balance we would prefer to invest in a European company over a company somewhere else if everything else is equal. At the same time, if you look at our portfolio, you will see that 50% or more of our portfolio companies are actually in the United States and North America. We also invest in Asia, and so the reason why that is the case is, I think on the one hand it's a numbers game. So I mean we see probably around 1,000 or so investment opportunities per year, and then we try to select maybe 5 or 10 that we can actually invest in. And obviously the United States is not just more advanced. I mean they got started earlier in the biotech space and have more experience maybe as a market, but they also have a much larger number of mature biotech companies that you can invest in. So I think that's one part. One specific point, and when you can talk about the ecosystem and the management teams that sometimes on average in the US have more experience just because the industry is older. One other point is the question, how do you find an exit? How can you basically find liquidity for your investment? And while M&A, the selling the company to a large pharma player should work equally well for a company wherever it's based, the other path, taking the company public, of course, depends on where you're located. And I think if you look at the number of IPOs in the biotech space in the United States over the last 12 or 24 or 36 months versus Europe, you can see that gradient. So that, of course, makes it easier both for the investors to find ultimate liquidity, but also for the companies to raise more capital, because once they access the public markets, they have basically access to larger amounts of capital also over longer periods of time. So that makes it, I think, easier for those companies to thrive.
Okay. And what about investing in Switzerland specifically compared to, let's say, other European countries?
Yeah, so I mean, we have and continue to invest in Switzerland. Again, for us, I mean, we look at this on a global stage, but I think the good news obviously is that Switzerland brings a lot of the ingredients that you need to start a great biotech company. So you have great science here, you have obviously great pharma companies that both provide the talent and the experience that you need. You have local capital from angel investors to earlier stage investors to later stage investors like ourselves. So I think Switzerland is one of those countries which really is more successful than you would expect based on the population size.
Okay. And just considering, you know, all the regions of the world you invest in, do you have a favorite one or one that you think it's particularly promising?
A portfolio company or
no? A region, a country or a region of, you know, all the ones you have experience with.
Yeah, I mean we tend to have right now, obviously a lot of the companies that are founded, and so also quite a number of our investments are in the Boston region and in the San Francisco Bay Area. That's not very original, I guess that's where a lot of the companies are located. But again, I think here in Europe, I mean, Switzerland certainly, I think also Scandinavia, the Netherlands, these are also countries that have a similar dynamic of having sort of strong innovation, investors, science, some pharma experience coming together. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so you invest, you know, in medical biotech, healthcare, you know, all the medtech, all these areas. So within these areas that you invest in, what do you think are, you know, the hottest trends that you're seeing right now?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the question is sort of what you can measure that by, sort of how much money is going into different areas, and that's, I think, one of the areas. Immuno-oncology was just discussed. For us, it's really, I mean, obviously we're aware of those trends and are interested in what's happening, but ultimately each investment sort of has to stand on its own feet, and so I think on the one hand, we can get very excited about new things that are happening in gene therapy or in other areas in immuno-oncology and various. If you think about indication areas, obviously oncology, orphan diseases, immunology, CNS, I mean, those are the big topics that will provide the majority of biotech opportunities. But ultimately, I think we're looking at each investment by itself, and sometimes we invest in things that might seem boring. I mean, it might be drugs that have been around for many decades, but someone finds a twist to basically coming back to the question, sort of, what do you do for the patient? You can take an old drug and do something really new and innovative for the patient if you can deliver it in a new way, or if you can make it safer. And so I think that can equally provide an interesting investment thesis, like something that just fell out of a Nature or Science paper 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm. And usually, the way companies that are developing a therapy and the way that companies that are developing a device, let's say a medical device, is quite different. So, yeah, can you tell us a bit more about how is it different investing in these two types of companies?
Yeah, so the majority of our investments goes into biotech, pharma, so that's probably about 90% or so, and then the balance is diagnostics and medtech and digital health. And I think medtech had a more difficult time lately in terms of finding investors. So many of the US investors in the life sciences have exited, have basically left the medtech space altogether. So it's actually reasonably hard to find medtech investors because I think in recent times the dynamic was that on the one hand it's more difficult to take these companies public. It's more difficult to also sell these companies, because for a biotech company, if you're a cancer company, you have a great new drug with early clinical data, you can easily find a dozen pharma companies that will be interested in this. In the medtech space, because it's usually very specific type of technology you have, sometimes there are only 2 or 3 companies in your space that could acquire your company or work with your company, partner with your company, and then one of them may have an in-house competitive product and another one may not be interested right now, and so that has led to longer holding periods for these investments, and so I think generally medtech has been more difficult, but at some point, again, there are of course individual companies that can be very promising.
Okay. And well, I meant to ask you this earlier, but obviously you are working as an investor now. But before that, I know you've been doing a lot of academic research, and also you work as a physician. So I'm just very interested in learning why you decided to make this change, and how is it different? Do you enjoy it?
Yeah. So the second question, yes, I do enjoy it. Start with that. And I think I've been always sitting between different chairs, so I was always interested in the medicine, obviously, so I studied medicine, but also in the scientific and business aspects. And so after medical school, I then first went to the US and spent a couple of years in a lab doing research, and there basically had a chance to get exposed to biotech startup companies. It was a time in the late 90s when sort of everybody was starting companies left, right, and center, and so I think that had a lasting impact on me. And then after that, I came back and first worked in the clinic. Again, had a chance to work with startup companies, and then ultimately got drawn into this innovative space. And since I'm not a genius like Ulf, who can sort of start his own company around the technology he invented, I thought the next best thing is to basically work with those companies as an investor.
Okay. Well, yeah, let's open some questions from the audience.
Personally, I think it's important, but in the end, I mean, like for a biotech company, for a venture company, it's important that you have a multitude of perspectives. So we have in our team people who come from hardcore finance backgrounds, people who come from the pharma industry, people who are biochemists or chemists or pharmacists. I think the medical perspective is an important one that we have to look at. But ultimately, in each investment, we work with outside experts to vet this. I mean, so I think that's generally true. I think we're obviously not smarter than other people, but we have access to, I mean, on the one hand, I think what helps is that we've seen a lot of these companies. Also over the years, HBM has invested in more than 100 companies and also been involved at the various stages of their development. And we, of course, use a network of experts to look at each opportunity. But the medical part is obviously important, much as the reimbursement part, which, for example, now becomes an increasingly important element, thinking about what kind of price can you get in different geographies for your drug. Yeah, so I mean, we of course try not to pay high prices when we invest in companies, but it's true that there are different ecosystems of valuations also, and at this point, a lot of US companies have higher valuations than their European counterparts. I mean, I think that makes it attractive to invest in Europe. You can also see that because US investors are increasingly coming into Europe, and you can now find also here in Basel companies that have well-known US investors. I think for them it would obviously be much easier to invest in front of their doorstep. The reason why they're coming here, among other things, is there's great science, there's great talent, but also the valuations are lower than they are in the US. And we had a discussion earlier with a gentleman who's working on introducing companies to Chinese investors. I think that's the same thing when at the Sachs conference last week, there were a couple of Chinese investors that also we met up with, and they said at this point that valuations in China are also getting relatively high, and so Chinese investors are coming to Europe, and there's a couple of examples now where Chinese investors make big investments into European companies. Okay, so I mean that is a really small part of what we do. Question was why we invest in funds. For us, the principal reason to invest in funds is to have access to types of investments that we would otherwise not have access to. So one, I think, good example is when we invest in China, we have a team of advisors in China that we've been working with, but we don't have people on the ground, HBM employees on the ground in China. And so one way for us to access interesting opportunities in China is to work with funds that are on the ground in China, and that then also invite us to co-invest with them into particular companies. So that's one way to do that. I think the main, I mean, for me personally, the main impact is that we have to really focus on the highest medical needs, because as a society, I think if you deal with life-threatening or sort of in other ways diseases that are impacting quality of life in a terrible way, then I think as society prioritizes where they want to spend money, they will gravitate towards those higher medical needs. So I think that's where we need to be, and I think that's also what is reflected in where biotech companies, maybe also compared even to larger pharma companies, are doing their work. They're focused on oncology and orphan diseases and other areas where there's either a very poor standard of care or sometimes no drug at all that serves those patients. So ultimately, I agree, some of those prices may come down, but I think if you look at the whole spectrum, then I think those indications, because they represent a higher value, will hopefully still get the type of reimbursement that makes it worthwhile for biotech companies to develop drugs there. No, but I mean, again, it's a topic that we're watching very closely, because any company that we invest in may be 5 or more years from actually introducing their drug into the market, and so we have to look ahead. And I think there have also been excesses of individual companies that have charged outrageous prices, and I think that's something that hurts patients, obviously, but that also hurts the industry as a whole. And so I think it's a good thing that the industry is now also coming out in favor of finding a good balance between the value that you deliver and the prices that you charge. No, all the time. No, I mean, actually, there's for fun, if you want to look at this, there's a US fund that is focused on the venture capital fund that's focused on the IT side, that's called Bessemer Ventures. And if you go to the Bessemer Ventures website, they have a small section there which says sort of our anti-portfolio, and basically they then sort of not only list the companies, but they also say this is this partner of ours. He was sort of at the house where Google was started, and sort of landladies, she really said you need to talk to Sergey Brin and Larry Page, and he said, now how can I get out of this house without talking to these guys? And then, so I mean obviously, and they actually obviously it shows that they're very successful, because they can sort of afford to sort of list sort of 10 super successful companies that they they did not invest in. But I think the same obviously applies to every investor, and so yeah, it shows we have to be humble, and it also shows in the end we don't have to invest in every good company. As long as the companies we invest in are reasonably successful, then that should work. Yeah, so I don't have any particular experience, I think, with those terms. I think generally there's a fair degree of experimentation that's happening right now, both in terms of the models of how do you start up companies, how do you finance companies, how do you deal with some of the restrictions that we mentioned about sort of the fund lives and so on. So I think experimentation is welcome. In the end, if the terms that someone puts in front of investors or entrepreneurs are too restrictive, then hopefully they will sort of, I think there's also a Darwinian element to that, and so if people have a choice, then they will maybe choose other types of investors. Yeah. So I mean, I think that's also happening on the IT side, I think, and then I mean the question is if you have some investors who can put a level of financial backing behind their portfolio companies that basically erases the competition. I think that's more likely to happen in areas where sort of money buys you success. And for example, if you have sort of 3 e-commerce companies that are otherwise similar, then and one of them can sort of expand much more quickly into other geographies, then they may ultimately dominate the market. I think in biotech, ultimately you're still bound to the success of your compound or your product in the clinic, so it may not have the same impact, but yeah, it's something we can maybe discuss offline then. So I think on one level it's the realization that there's just a lot of value being generated in the biotech space, and I think people, and that means life science investors, but also generalists are going into the sector. At the same time, there's of course also a correlation with the general risk aversion or risk appetite that investors have, and so in an environment where it's more difficult to find returns elsewhere, investors are more willing to enter the biotech space, which is perceived as more risky, and if then the environment changes, then some of those generalist investors may also withdraw from biotech sector. And for us as a life science investor, we're there to stay, but I think that is probably also an element that might change.
All right, thanks a lot, Chandra.
Thank you, Clara.